We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giuliano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am super excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Jacob Thomas, Communications Director at Common Defense. Jacob, so thank you so much for being a guest with us here today. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yes, thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here. Yes, so my name is Jacob Thomas. I am the Communications Director for Common Defense, which is a large grassroots progressive organization of veterans across the country. I use he, him pronouns. And yeah, I feel like growing up, so I grew up in the South, little gay kid to very conservative, parents involved in the church. So I think I was always like told I was going to be a pastor or something when I grew up. And I was like, I don't know about that. I don't want that. And so I kind of I had always wanted to, I don't know if I could really conceptualize what I wanted to be because I was didn't even know who I was yet. But I think firefighter was always on the list. I was like, oh my goodness, I want to be a firefighter. And that was probably just because I thought they were hot. As a kid, like you little gay kid, you're like, yeah, that looks fun. I want to go do that. But yeah, and then I kind of just did not. I was a volunteer firefighter for all of 6 months.
There you go.
Or a year. So I guess I still technically did that. But yeah, I mean, being a community organizer and helping create inclusive policy was not the top of the list as the 10-year-old little Jacob was thinking of jobs.
Rarely do people say exactly where or what they're doing today. I think it's always interesting to think about little Christina or little Jacob to say, oh, when I grow up, I'm going to be this. I have so many questions about your vast experience in community organizing and really advocating for inclusive policies within really large systems. But I'd love to ask kind of how you see your personal journey really leading you to where you are today in terms of leading communications at Common Defense.
Yeah, I think doing the work with Common Defense is kind of this culmination of a decade of work I feel that I've been doing and engaging in. But it actually all started with, engaging in a policy piece that was very, intimate to my life. Kind of the first community organizing I ever did was 2012 with the Minnesota Marriage Amendment. So there was a bill that was up for a vote in 2012 that would have written into the state constitution that marriage was only between a man and a woman to exclude same-sex marriages, essentially. And that was the same year I came out, and it just was the thing that I feel I had to do. So I kind of cut my teeth organizing on that, calling into rural Minnesota. From a Lutheran church, actually, in Grand Forks, North Dakota, because I was stationed up in Grand Forks, Air Force Base at the time, so it was still active duty. And after kind of doing that work and seeing the win, I kind of knew that I had to be done doing just normal work, and that I needed to jump in and do organizing. So that was my first little taste there. And then kind of that 2012 was okay, I'm getting out of the military when my contract's up and I'm gonna go do this work full time. I didn't know where, I didn't know how, but I was like, this is what I have to go do. And so I started working in LGBT organizing. I helped run communications for a state-based LGBTQ civil rights organization called Outfront Minnesota. That kind of led to a lot of the DEI work that I started doing. We would go train organizations and companies on how to be inclusive and do kind of LGBTQ 101 trainings for the whole organizations, and also working with HR to develop policies and things like that. And then I kind of didn't for the longest time think that I could talk about military things and do this other type of work. I was like, that's separate. That was a different life. It was a different person. And, I'm focused now on doing LGBTQ work, or I'm focused now on, helping do racial justice or economic justice, whatever, it was at the time. But I largely just didn't talk about my military experience. I didn't talk about that space. And then finally, like, I met Common Defense just kind of by happenstance in 2017, and they were running a training called the Veterans Organizing Institute. And I was like, you know what? Like, I already know how to be an organizer, but I want to go learn what that means in the veteran context. And so I went and did that and fell in love with the organization, with the people. So I'd kind of been a member, volunteering with them, and then eventually came on staff to help run our comms program here.
Well, thank you for sharing your journey to this work. It sounds like whatever you participate in and advocate for, you are really passionate about and go headfirst in. When you shared about kind of your initial journey into being an activist and talking about really what's important to you, which includes LGBTQIA plus rights in the Deep South. These are not easy conversations to have as well, especially when we're talking about, things like same-sex marriages and being in a really religious, perhaps place as well. And, really finding, ways to have conversations and meaning as well. What did you learn about leaning into these kind of hard conversations where there is no kind of guidebook or framework for you to follow? If you say X, Y, and Z, this is what the other person is going to say.
Yeah. I mean, these conversations are like extremely, extremely difficult sometimes and extremely necessary. And so I've been doing, community organizing for a while. And then in 2015, I happened to be, I was still in the Air Force Reserves. So I was down in Biloxi, Mississippi doing training for some things. I was there for, like a couple months. And it was during that time that the 2015 SCOTUS decision on marriage came down. And, just seeing how people were reacting to that and how both in positive and negative ways just sparked my interest in really getting to understand some of that, right? I think we often have people who may don't agree with policies that we agree with, that we are trying to work for, or don't have the same ideals as we do. But how do we bridge those gaps and kind of come in and say, look, we both want good things for our communities. Here's why I believe this policy does that, or why, this or that piece is the way to go. And I think we've stopped having a lot of those conversations. And we've just kind of immediately write people off instead of trying to meet them where they're at and bring them, further. One thing that I've always kind of thought of is that we're all at different chapters of our own books, right? So like, I know probably way too much about the niche pieces of like LGBTQ work, and I don't know a lot about maybe this other topic. So like, I know I'm coming into spaces and we're not going to always be on the same page, but how do we work through each other's books together? How do we help write that next chapter and move forward? And I think that's the biggest thing that we've helped move people forward. And then we do that by having those conversations. And what I've noticed is a lot of times you feel like those conversations just go nowhere. And sometimes maybe that individual conversation doesn't, but what you're able to do is then over time, when we're building relationships with people, we can start to move and push them where they need to be. And so, I had the opportunity to go back home in March of this year and came back to a very different space where people that I never thought would kind of be super accepting would kind of be on our side of LGBTQ equality were and they were not only just being supportive and like nice, they were actually saying, oh, here's the things that we're doing in our community to make our whole community a safer and more inclusive space. And if you would have told me like, 15 years ago that I'd have that conversation with the same person that I had, had very different conversations about, LGBTQ identity as a kid, I would have never thought that would have happened, that they would have kind of come along that journey.
I love a good analogy. And I think that there is a difference between people being nice and having that understanding, and also demonstrating this is what we are doing as a next step to take action, to be supportive and go beyond just that understanding as well, which does take time. Bringing it kind of another level of potentially an example too is oftentimes folks have really hard conversations with their managers. There's power dynamics involved also. It's potentially managing across difference if you don't hold the exact same identities and experiences that your manager has, which is probably not the case. What advice do you have for managers to really come into these conversations with their teams with an open kind of heart and mind?
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, especially like for managers, like I think two things to really keep in mind is that you have power in the situation. Like you are coming into a space where like you are the authority, and that can sometimes be very off-putting, right? So if we're wanting to have kind of conversations, we need to be able to remove some of that worry that like, hey, look, we're trying to have this conversation, we're trying to work through this, like let's do that together and try and meet people on their level, knowing that you're kind of, that you need to kind of come down to their level to do that. And second, like I would always say, assume positive intent, right? So we want to make sure that we aren't just immediately jumping in and being like, well, you said this thing and I'm interpreting that this way and therefore like you're wrong. We want to be able to come in and say, okay, we're going to say things wrong. We're going to do, like, especially as we're learning, as we're trying to grow here, like that growth is going to have road bumps. It's going to have obstacles. But at the end of the day, if we're like working towards it together, then we can understand that and not have those obstacles be a larger hindrance than it needs to be. So I would say assume positive intent, both, in your work with other colleagues, but also in the work that you're trying to do with your employees. I think, a lot about with the LGBTQ kind of one-on-one trainings that we would run, where we're talking to, employees who maybe have never even thought about what pronoun usage is or what that looks like. And so you're kind of, sometimes starting from square one, and there's going to be mistakes there, right? And as long as we know that people are trying and moving forward and we're able to see that, then that's okay if there's some mistakes. One of the things we would always do in those initial trainings is just sit people down and ask them, when was the first time you ever thought about gender, right? And for, queer people, for trans people, for women generally, that there's actually an answer that they can go back to and like, oh, here's where I realized that like gender was a thing in the world and how I needed to interact with it. A lot of cis straight white men, like God love them, but like they just generally don't have any concept. They've never had to explore that and really interrogate those pieces. So we're meeting them at a different point to try and catch them up. And that might be a lot of work, but it's necessary work. It needs to be done. And if they're receptive to that, then we can move them forward. If they're not, and I think this is a different issue, right? So we've got the tough conversations, which we can have and I encourage. And then there's like times where people have made clear that they do not want to have those conversations or engage in that work to be better. And that's where you have to make other decisions of, like, are you the best fit for this role or at this company if you can't kind of get on board with some of these things after we've had these tough conversations.
Every person, along with every kind of organization as well, is at a different part of their journey, a different page in their own book, as you were talking about. And to your point as well, the organizations or the systems that were coming in, a lot of them, at least in the United States, as a generalization, were built by people in power who were historically cisgender, straight, white men. And we're seeing some progressive changes here, but I definitely want to ask you around kind of your advocacy work, especially with LGBTQIA plus rights within a historically not necessarily most inclusive progressive organization, which is the military. In this process, what was the key to really making that sustainable change for the future? And, for folks who are listening, who are working in, whether it's government, nonprofit, their own, company, organization, maybe it's the military. I definitely wanted to ask.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I kind of started doing kind of LGBTQ positive work in the military, and you think too, like at the time, like so I was doing this work. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in 2011. Was kind of the first official. It was repealed in 2010. They actually went into effect in 2011. And I came out. I was serving from 2008 through 2016. So I served about half and half there. And when I came out in 2012, I kind of did not think I'd be doing any like inside the military activism around this issue. I was like, you know what, I'm just going to do my work, stick my head down, and get things done. And I kind of got pulled into the work kicking and screaming by early career opportunity people who knew me because I was doing sexual assault work with them, kind of in the same office, helping do victim advocacy work. And so they were kind of just like, so you're gonna do like an LGBTQ booth at our culture fair, right? And I'm like, what? No, I'm not gonna do that. And they're like, yeah, you're gonna do an LGBT culture booth. And I was like, okay. And so that was kind of where like that initial start. So we created a few little, a group of us, kind of gay military members on the base, started putting this together and working through and just kind of being visible on the base. And that, kind of leads to those other tough conversations and things, especially when they knew you before and they're like, wait, I thought you were married to a woman. And I'm like, yeah, I was, and now I'm gay. Let's talk about it. But there was, in some of those aspects, it's interesting because the military kind of is very good about like policy comes out and an order goes out, and you just kind of like, even if you don't agree with the order, you just do what needs to be done because that's how the military works. So when President Obama and DOD was like, hey, like gays are allowed in the military now, everybody's like, okay, well, we're gonna suck it up and like gays are allowed in the military. And to be clear, like LGBTQ people have served in the military forever. This like, didn't magically just, pop out in 2010. But some of that change is going to happen, and some things are just never going to be progressive in the military at all. Right? We still saw the fight for trans service members to be able to serve that went all throughout Trump's presidency and finally was kind of put to rest. We just recently, as early as this summer, like the military is finally allowing people who are HIV positive and undetectable to commission and deploy, which was a huge fight to allow to happen, and came with a lot of HIV stigma. So there's still going to be things to push in any organization, especially the military. But when we're thinking through that, like creating that sustainable change sometimes means like creating new structures themselves. When we're doing a lot of this work, if we're operating under the same framework as before, then we're not going to truly get at just representation at critical and like mass change in institutions. We have to be kind of thinking different from the way that we've built all these structures before, under like this kind of just capitalist kind of dogma.
we have to get creative and we have to challenge the status quo and also understand that change is not going to happen overnight, but there are things that we as individuals can do every day, decision makers, executives, whatever role that you have. It takes everybody to really think critically about how we can be including everyone and really be intentional there. A lot of folks, their entry point is training, it's education, which is very important to the conversation. And we know that it is something that shouldn't exist in a silo. You've led diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings in the past. How do you take training another step further so folks feel like they are empowered or enabled to apply their training to their day-to-day decisions or process, inside or outside of work for that matter?
For sure. I mean, I think it's a great point, right? That it is, all of us at all of our levels are our own leaders and can like push change in the ways that we have access to. Um, and yeah, with training, I think training is crucial to that in one aspect, just because I think for the most part, we all want to be, good people, right? We all want to treat others fairly and we want to do the right thing. In general, sometimes we just don't know what that is or how to do it. So that's where training can come in and just be like, hey, look, here's here's why we're using pronouns. Here's why that's important. And then, for a lot of people, that's all it takes to have that light bulb say, oh, okay, like I get that, like I'm going to do it. And so it's just like about that education of why things like this are important. And that also, like, I feel like too often we treat training as just this one and done. Like we checked the box, we did the training. Now, like, we'll wait until next year for the next annual training, right? There's not anything that helps push that out. So that's where I would say, within organizations, having those trainings crucial, having kind of leaders in that space who then help champion that kind of those knowledge points outside of training is equally as important, whether that is, you yourself as an employee just kind of on the line, or a middle manager, or someone from the C-suite even who's there to then kind of champion and say, okay, we had that training a month ago, like what have we done since then? What have we implemented from that? Are we making pronouns mandatory in signature blocks, right? Creating those action steps that help bring that work out and push, to then say, okay, in between this time, we've done these things before the next training happens. And what is that next training? Is that a 102? Is that a, kind of a refresher? Are we going more in depth on a particular issue? Building, that kind of levels of training instead of just the one note. Every year we do this particular training and, we sign it off until next year.
Absolutely. It's having that accountability and ownership as well. I know I've heard some organizations also asking after trainings or during those performance reviews, check-ins, like what have you specifically done, or how have you kind of rethought about your processes since this happened as well. So it's really important to think about and have that self-awareness. I want to ask from your perspective, knowing that whether we're talking about LGBTQ plus rights, whether we're talking about veterans, no group is a monolith, but what do you wish more people knew in recruiting and retaining veterans in their organization? We know that more organizations are having veteran employee resource groups, and really actively recruiting from veteran organizations as well, but want to ask your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many things. I think a lot of what I kind of wish that recruiters kind of understood more, and I think this is getting there as well, but for a lot of military folks, like it could be really isolating leaving the military. Like you leave this entire structure that's built up, and it's just coming back into the civilian world is just a different animal. So that transition piece can be really hard. I think kind of, so that would be one piece of just like understanding that like they're coming into a space, how do we like help build community for them? I think employee resource groups or BRGs, whatever we're calling them, are a great solution for part of that. But also helping integrate into the wider group too, because we also don't want just like the vets in their own little corner doing their own little vet thing. Like we want to be able to kind of integrate back into society in a way. So I would say that would be one. Understanding, especially from a recruiter perspective, that veterans may not be able to, may not know how to talk about what they did, and translate that into the skills, kind of to meet the resume. But I guarantee you a lot of veterans have skills that will transfer very easily between jobs. And that's why I think you're seeing a lot of hiring happen. Like people go after veterans because they understand that there's kind of a certain type of, work ethic, and just kind of when I'll always I feel like people are always they're like, oh, we're so stressed about this upcoming project or whatever. I'm like, we'll be fine, right? Like there's a calmness that veterans have because they're like, well, we signed up to get shot at, so getting this thing done by the deadline feels like no pressure, because it's just a different thinking, and I think that's really helpful in a lot of scenarios to just be like, hey, let's simmer down and think through things logically, and kind of take that step back. I think sometimes veterans can be really good at that aspect. And I would also say one thing that I would love to see happen more in the HR space for retaining veterans is really understanding veteran benefits better, of what does it mean? How does this, the VA benefit work with our healthcare? Can the, what are all of those kinds of things, which get wonky and kind of vary from veteran to veteran in a lot of ways, of what they're qualified for, if they're disabled or not, all those types of things. But having a more generalized even understanding of what benefits are out there and how to help your veteran employees match the right benefits, I think would be a huge help, that I think HR, entities could take on.
Absolutely, especially recognizing the full lives of veterans and employees, and understanding the support that is needed as well, in the conversations that need to be had. A lot of transferable skills, as we have seen, and I have also kind of discussed as well. Jacob, our time is ending together, but is there anything that I didn't ask that you would like to share with folks who are listening, or underscoring any kind of key takeaways from our conversation?
Oh, kind of a summary. I would say, hmm, I think really just the big piece is, kind of the two things of I think it's under helping, remembering that, kind of leading with that, assuming positive intent, and helping people get through their mistakes as long as they are trying to be better, is a key piece. And also recognizing that sometimes people are actively trying to not get better, and that requires maybe some other approaches from the HR team, in other retrainings, discipline, whatever it might need to be. We want to be able to give people the space to grow and move, and recognize when they're not willing to do that growth themselves.
It's not a one size fits all approach, let's say, as well. People are coming in with different intentions. So the approach needs to be different. Jacob, thank you so much for all of the work that you are doing, and for being a guest on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Yes, thanks so much for having me. It was absolutely lovely.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, in AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.